Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Classical Revolution here on Idagio. My name is Rachel Fenlon. I'm the host of the series here. I'm actually talking to you today from Salzburg, where I'm here at the Festspiele, and I'm so excited for today's guest. Hailed by the New York Times as one of the new generation of leading Berlin's classical music scene, Jordan de Souza is a fantastic musician and a wonderful friend of mine. He's the first Kapellmeister at the Komische Oper Berlin. And with the company, aside from performing tons of new premieres, he's also performed or conducted 4 new productions with Barry Kosky to great acclaim. He makes his debuts next season with the London Philharmonic, Garsington Opera, Deutsche Oper Berlin, and has recently conducted at the Hanover Staatsoper, Houston Grand Opera, Orchestre Metropolitain in Montreal, Bregenz Festival, and the Canadian Opera Company. And I'm so excited to welcome him today. Please welcome Jordan de Souza. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, Rachel.
How are you today?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. It's so nice to have you on the show. I like to just begin straight off the bat by asking my guests what their introduction to music was and whether there was even a specific musical moment for them that
Yeah,
sparked this.
I was kind of lucky in a way that I was the 7th of 8 kids, and music was always a big part of our family. And so I was lucky that I kind of grew up always with so much music. We had 4 pianos in the house, and my brothers were practicing. So it was just a house full of music. We had an electric organ in the house. And so me as a young kid, it was like one of the first languages I think I ever discovered was music. It was just always part of it. So I was lucky that even like my dad, who was not a trained musician, but played every day, he could play anything by ear, and he played really for the passion of it. And in some way was the purest musician to follow an example like that. And my mom was a trained pianist. So I was lucky that music was a big part of my childhood.
Wow. And was there a specific moment with classical music in general, or was there a particular performance that stood out to you when you were younger, or a particular time, a moment with an instrument that you remember?
Yeah, I think with an instrument, probably the first time I heard an organ in the church as a kid, and thinking like, what is that? How can a sound envelop you that way? Because I heard an
Hmm.
organ much before I ever heard an orchestra play. And with classical music, like I went to a choir school, St. Mike's Choir School in Toronto, and so I think it was like my introduction to music was like 16th century polyphony. We sang Palestrina masses as kids, and in some way, it was kind of the right way to track. We sang some Monteverdi motets. Then we kind of traced all the way up. We didn't sing really that much 21st century or 20th century music. And but in some way, that was a really good foundation to lay
Hmm.
for all the stuff that I was going to be able to discover afterwards.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? What kind of foundation did that lay for you? It was actually something I wanted to ask you, anyways,
Yeah.
particularly coming from that background.
Yeah, like
What?
for example, I like as a keyboard player, um, for me as a kid, they gave me the chance there. So there was always so many choir practices going on, more than any, and it was kind of an amazing thing. They never hired a professional accompanist there. They always used their students, and there was always a really talented student who was 17 or 18 who was going to go off to Curtis or something like that. And they had one almost every year. It's really a remarkable tradition. But again, I think maybe it's a theme we're going to come back to today, is this idea of education, and actually whatever you honor as an institution, or maybe broader even as a country, is what you cultivate. And that's what was there, the model from when you're 8 years old as a student there, looking up to these really remarkable but young guys that you're just one of them. You're playing basketball with them outside in the
Hmm.
schoolyard, and then you go in and you're singing some old motets, and he's playing the organ. And that for me was really something that they also gave me the chance. I remember when I was like 11, 12 years old, and there was a choir practice, and the teacher said, "Can you?" Because they had kind of they were always keeping their eyes open for and trying to test just to see the different aptitudes of their students, and looking for somebody who could help down the road. And he said, "Okay, you come and play this rehearsal." And they were rehearsing. I couldn't even tell you what it was. We were rehearsing a mass, and it was the Kyrie. I remember it was the Kyrie, and it was a 5-voice motet. And he put it down. He said, "Okay, just play here. Just play the bass line." And he was conducting, the choir was singing, and I'm playing along the bass line. He noticed that.
Hmm.
"Can you add in the alto line too?" Okay, we did it again. And now I'm trying to just read those 2 lines. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he was kind of kind of setting down these tracks in my mind of how I should even read a score, that music is not only vertical, but really the two horizontal, the way the voices interact with each other, but also being able to phrase and follow each of those. And a lot of those things are actually what kind of defines me as a musician now. Those are the kinds of things I still see in a score when I study, are those types of relationships. So that's like kind of a microcosm of what that whole experience was like. And that he would, it was fun. But, and the testing and the kind of always trying to stay sharp and never wanting, that was also the competitiveness of it in a healthy way was kind of encouraging.
That's so interesting. I've never heard you talk about that. So it's interesting to also hear that educational process, and to hear that there was sort of this hierarchy, and how that builds something as well.
Yeah.
I'm curious also, you have such a unique path, which maybe you can like also elaborate on a little bit, but then you studied organ, and then you went into choral conducting, and that's led you now into basically a full-on operatic conducting and symphonic conducting career. I'm wondering if you could just like walk us through that path a little bit, because I find it quite
Yeah,
special.
like as a young musician, it was always clear to me that I wanted to be a conductor of kind of church music, and play the organ. That was such an important part of my life, and conduct choirs, because that's what I knew growing up.
Mm.
And so that was always, where I focused my energies, until I discovered things like that opera and symphony and everything incorporated a lot of the same elements, but somehow it was that part of it, the choral element, the chorus, that the kind of text work, all of those things were just part of now a bigger whole. And I realized I could sharpen other skills and learn other parts of the craft, that this was just one part of it. But for me, that was really a clear thing, that that's what I wanted to do. And I really focused, like when I was an undergrad at McGill doing my organ degree in Montreal, like I was really, for me, those sacred hours, those quiet hours of the morning, practicing by yourself in an organ loft, that was sacred time to me. That time of, but once it was clear to me, once I had a taste of the other thing, that wasn't everything, that was just a part. But it's funny that now, at the phase I am now, I kind of crave a little bit to be by myself in an organ loft practicing music, and taking ownership of my music making in a different way than when it is about enabling other people. So in a way, it's been it never felt to me like a kind of unique journey. It just felt natural. And I always did try to take the challenge that was in front of me and do the best I could and learn the most I could from it. And then when I got kind of fascinated by the next challenge, I tried to chase that one too.
Yeah. And this moment that brought you to opera, what was that entry point like for you?
Yeah, I was at college, and it was Così fan tutte. And it was just the kind of thing of like, I didn't know what an accompanied recitative was. I didn't know I didn't know anything. I never heard Italian. There was like just a whole world of things that opened up. I never heard ensembles of that degree of emotional depth. And I didn't obviously understand it all then, but you can kind of especially with somebody like Mozart, the potential, like even, when you hear the first chord of the Magic Flute, E flat major, it's just a chord, sure, but actually it kind of contains everything. Like Dies Bildnis, the tenor aria that comes later, is also in flat. I hear that when that happens. The end of the opera is in E flat major. The beginning of Wagner operas in E flat, like all of a sudden somehow it contains all of this really. And the more you discover, the more you're kind of, awake to all of these things that are, kind of always pulsing around us.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I love that. I really love that. Something I definitely like to talk about on the show is this idea of breaking rules as classical musicians. And I'm curious what your take is on that. And rather, like, when have you yourself what's your philosophy around that? I think we all have, as artists, some kind of philosophy around it. And I'm curious what yours is.
It's so funny. I haven't actually thought about this idea of breaking rules. And when you said it, and maybe it's because you just had me talking about the choir school stuff, that it just brought back this memory that I haven't thought about in so many years. And I really probably shouldn't tell the story because it really cast me into terror. But I was, maybe that's part of it too. And I think this is true of other people too, who end up finding a more balanced way of leadership. But as young people, we can sometimes be rather intolerable. And I remember, like, after I told you about the nice early choir school years, when I was in my later years, when I was really the full-time accompanist of the school, I sang very little in my last years there at the choir school because I was really playing concerts all the time, masses every weekend. And that was a great training that before I even got to college, I had spent like thousands of hours practicing and playing for all these choirs and concerts all over the world. It was an amazing experience, you know? And I think that's part of the reason I never really felt a strong, any kind of performance anxiety, is because as a kid, I had to find a way to really go well with it, because I had to figure out a way 4 or 5 times a week. I think in England, they have a tradition like that too. And I think there's obviously downsides to putting too much pressure on kids too, and not always giving them the flexibility to find their own kind of natural path and way of expression in that system. But for some people, it ends up being a really great kind of catalyst. But I was like in the 11th grade, so I was maybe 17 years old, and we used to go on these tours, and we were in Florida, and I hadn't been getting along with the conductor very well at that point for like a week. He kept, I forget what it was, but I was terribly idealistic, and I'm 100% sure I was 100% to blame for it. But he, of course, had to endure the brunt of it. And he had been giving me all this hard time in the thing, and he wasn't letting me do it. And I was playing all these concerts constantly. They had like this extra car that was taking me from one place to the next. Anyway, so then I decided to act out a little bit. And we were doing this piece called the Battle Hymn of the Republic, you know, and there's this big piano solo in the middle, and it's like, I don't know, 30 seconds long, a big modulation to another section. And I decided in these concerts to slowly, like at the beginning of the week and then throughout the whole like next 10 days, just slowly extend it, at first by like a measure, then by like 10 measures. And then by the time I was playing, I remember him because he used to conduct through the interludes, and he was conducting. I was just playing in different styles, and so he had to try and adjust. It was like a terrible thing to do, but it was my way of kind of saying, "Hey, listen, I can't stand for this. I'm going to show my rebellion in the best way I know how." And I remember once they took me aside after the concert. They're like, "Listen, that you were playing for like 2 minutes in the middle of a 4.5-minute piece, just like spinning off in these crazy keys." And my friends all thought it was so funny. And I think back, and I'm so almost ashamed to think I got to write this guy an email and apologize to him for what I did to him. But it was a way of, I don't know, you know, that's breaking the rules in a way. And I don't do those kinds of things anymore. But I would say, you know, I don't really think about it in the way I approach things these days. I don't think so much about breaking. To be honest, I went through a phase, you know, when I first was coming on to the scene, of saying, "Hey, how could they do that way? Oh, this has to be like this. Oh, how could they do this? Oh, I have this new idea. Oh, we're going to do all these phrasings in the Mozart that are," and then somehow you start to realize that all that kind of artifice around that is me kind of hiding a little bit from just searching for the real truths, and I'm putting myself somehow now above the composer. And that this idea of how do I serve this music best, and I still try to do it with my voice, like the way I understand the phrasing of a piece, especially if it's very different. That's no problem for me. If I have to try to it's kind of a task to convince the musicians, and that's also a good litmus test to know if your idea is worthwhile, because if you can't convince them, there's no way you're going to have a chance to convince the people behind you. And so in that way, I've kind of in the last few years found myself respecting a lot more the traditions of things. Not that I always follow them, but I'm really interested to know also how great musicians who have gone before us have kind of solved the problems that are inherent in some scores, or have approached with different types of imagination, and developed different ways of speaking the language of each of these composers. So that has actually fascinated me a lot more. But I think, you know, maybe that I'm in such an environment at a place like the Komische Oper too, of this nature of, you know, not rebellion, but of saying, no, we're not going to just take this for what you say it is because you tell us to. We're actually going to really try and look at this piece and see with fresh eyes, what are we capable of teasing out of this, or how does this speak to a contemporary audience? And the funny thing there, even like with a guy like Barry Kosky, who's a fantastic, of course, stage director and colleague, and he he's never trying to, he doesn't come in there saying, oh, I'm gonna really shock them with this one. That's kind of who he is to see. He couldn't, if you gave him a Dr. Seuss book to read, like even he couldn't help himself but, you know, bring it to life in his zany kind of crazy singular wacky way. And that's something I think we appreciate about, not everybody gets the chance to show that much of their individual personality on that big a scale. But you kind of have to earn it too. I think that's part of the reason that guys like Chernyakov and Herheim and these types of people are able to kind of find a way to say what they have to say. Kastorf too. Like, it doesn't matter if you like or don't like what they have to say, but it provokes you. And I think that's kind of an interesting element of theater.
Yeah, it's that was definitely going to be another question of mine, is like what the influence has been for you being at the Komische, being, you know, coming from Canada, where companies certainly take risks, but the Komische is like actually really celebrated for this, celebrated for being completely outside of the box in so many ways. And yeah, I mean, has that, it must have pushed you, it must have challenged a lot of your boundaries, like even just talking about productions. And has some of that really even changed your idea about a piece or about an opera, or what's that journey been like?
I would say absolutely that it's really, in a way, formed the way I approach musical theater in a, you know, or really any type of music now. I see with those eyes, like we've got the goggles that we have like our glasses frame, and we're constantly adjusting the frames with all of these new influences we've had, and that kind of forms our picture of the world. But in a way, I never felt that the Komische Oper actually that, or maybe the way I felt there was always actually very freed all of a sudden, that I was not having to, you know, because you're right, there is definitely an advantage to the fact that the house, like when you arrive there, you already know what the reputation of the house is. People are not showing up there. The few, you know, this famous stories there of like Calixto Bieto had done a production of Entführung, of the abduction from the Seraglio, and it was like a really legendary, scandalous Berlin production. And every year they played the production, they would get like a bunch of letters every performance, because some nice tourists were looking for like a, you know, museum kind of theater, like opera experience, worked, oh well, Mozart opera, fantastic, in Berlin, we'll see it. And then they came there and there's like naked people getting body parts cut off in the middle of the opera. They're like, what's going on there? Maybe you should have brought your kids to this night, you know. But it's kind of so it's true, people come there, and that gives you a huge flexibility there, because the people on stage have already had their minds really open to a lot of different influences. There's things you can ask of them inevitably that you couldn't ask anywhere. Like there are other places and there are other circumstances under which you can achieve those things, but it's just such a freeing thing at the Komische Oper, that you're really able to try and find the kind of singular voice of a piece and just chase that, you know, and everybody's kind of jumps on board. It's a really remarkable place for that. But I think even my influence to my first kind of introduction of working on a production from the German Regietheater kind of world was actually at the COC, at the Canadian Opera Company, with the Klaus Guth's Figaro. And that was the first time that I'd seen videos of other productions, but I never really worked on one and got to see, not just because that's the thing, we're lucky sometimes working on these productions that you get to go through the process and understand on a deeper level why some of these choices were made, how they were arrived at. Because I don't know, other people, I admire theater goers who can really go and not have known about these productions and actually take it all and say, oh, that was this and this, because I'm not that guy. I go to theater, I'm like, well, I have no idea what happened. Even if it's a piece I know, I go, I'm like, I have to read a review to say, oh, that's what the guy was thinking about. I have to read the program notes. I don't know. I'm like the slowest learner in some ways of some things, you know. And,
interesting.
But in some way, it's I found the Komische Oper to be a very it's been kind of an empowering kind of a thing, but also it's a great balance to find of being there and then being, like you mentioned, at a place like Houston and saying, okay, here I am now. We have a good length rehearsal period. We have exceptionally gifted singers. Now, where am I? What's my language going to be? And to be honest, it was
Mm,
basically the same. Like you kind of find your voice and the things that are important to you and the things that you want to, and then you just tailor fit it to the great people you have in front of you and say, okay, I imagine that twice as fast, or it's articulated like this, or more chatty, but this guy actually sounds the best and makes the most dramatic sense in his arc to do it like that. Let's try that. And that's an exciting way, because then you realize again the flexibility of these great composers and these great pieces, that they lend themselves to that type of, that if you've done the right kind of archaeological work in your studying, that then you're ready to be open to what
mhm,
the process actually reveals. And that's the great thing, I think, too, that Barry and I, we've done 4 new productions together, like you mentioned, and we're doing a 5th in the fall. And it's
mhm,
kind of we have almost, I think we only talked about one of the pieces in advance. Like I showed up at Komische. He had told me his idea in a very broad strokes, no particulars. And we arrive on day 1 because we have 8 weeks, right? And I've been to the Bauprobe, so I've seen the set. I know basically
yeah,
the concept, but we don't talk about any specifics of things. And then we're there on the first day, and he gives always the first 2 days maybe to just for me to work on music, and he's there in the room, and we both go in on it. So like a piece like Bohème, we realized on the first day that, okay, wait a second, we are both after this kind of parlando thing. We're both after this kind of natural realism to try and find, okay, let's see now how we're both going to chisel away at this and figure out what our kind of team vision based on these great people. And he's so amazing at that, of really being able to let people express themselves,
yeah.
and then he finds a way to, okay, maybe you could try it this way instead, rather than imposing his idea on somebody. He's really I think that's really a gift that a lot of us, even not directors, can learn from.
That's fantastic. I love this. I love this idea, or this what you shared on flexibility, and I think that that's just a great. It's just a great way of looking at things, and also this idea of the glasses, and that you're just sort of like adding these, and then you're wearing them all the time. So, like you say,
Yeah,
of course, you go to Houston because
yeah,
you know you've still got those
yeah,
glasses on, and
yeah.
no, it's fantastic. Um, I'm curious where you stand on how political you do you think that a music can be, or more specifically, opera can be, and do you feel like it can play a political role in society, or how do you generally feel about that subject?
I think there's no question about music's kind of ability. Like we see it in so many ways to unite us and to share. Also, it can share powerful messages like Bertolt Brecht kind of world as well, and motivate people to want to have action. And but I think everybody has to find in their own space who to it's hard to prescribe those things in a way, because everybody is so individual, and everybody's goal, I think, in some way, or everybody's duty is, as an adult, to find a kind of how can I contribute from myself the best way to society. And I think like the lessons that we could learn from music making, to like, for example, with all of this there's so much unrest, kind of geopolitical unrest in the world right now. And but one of the things I notice is common in the way we talk about it is it's always in a very kind of negative way. It's about destroying the people who believe something different than what we think. And it's not a bad thing to destroy beliefs that don't that deserve to be destroyed and that are outdated and that don't honor all people as equal. That is totally necessary. But the idea of lifting people up and lifting the idea of what the thing to which we strive ought to be. We said that earlier in the conversation, this idea of what's honored in a country
Mm,
is what's cultivated there. And this idea, that's an idea from a book called The Geography of Genius that I was reading for the last few weeks, which I think is a really remarkable book that traces like what made ancient Athens, what made Venice, or Vienna, or even like America, the New World. What made these places such hotbeds for creativity and really
mm.
brilliant artists and thinkers and things like that. And oh man, I'm about to. Well, how did I get into the Geography of Genius?
Well,
What's the honor of it is
I mean,
cultivated.
cultural context, and
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this idea that, like lifting up the model to which we ought to aspire, like rather
Mm-hmm.
than finding a way, like meme culture doesn't help that either, because it kind of,
Mm-hmm.
and again, it is an important tool and it is a powerful tool, all of that stuff. But how are we finding a way to better coexist? And then you look to any kind of orchestra, any type of opera, like that's a lot of disparate people with a lot of different beliefs that are coming together and finding a way to say, wait a second, together we can achieve something greater than any of us could possibly do alone. And maybe we're not actually going to be, maybe that's not exactly the way we would choose to do it individually, but that actually doesn't matter if we actually are all finding a way as a body to kind of keep this thing healthy and growing forward. And that's a tricky thing. And that's why I'm not always quick to speak out, because I think also these things, they need to be acted upon quickly, but they have to be thought through. And this
Mm.
idea of having to have a trigger quick response to everything that goes on, it can be really overwhelming just to keep up with the pace of a 24-hour news cycle in a global world in which, even though you and I both live in Berlin, you're in Salzburg right now, it feels like you could be in Canada, I could be here, I could be in the Arctic, and we could still do this. Like, that's an incredible thing, but it's also an incredibly intimidating and a heavy weight for us all to bear if we haven't found the right way to do it. So that's in that way, I think we need to take the teamwork elements. We need to take the thing of finding the best in not only ourselves, but also in others, and maybe even others
Mm.
with whom we don't agree about everything, and
Mm-hmm.
finding, because that's going to be a much more likely way. Like, I've seen conflicts resolved in the opera room that I thought were unsolvable. Like, I thought these guys were going to go to blows. I thought, man, get that sword away. They were like, even though it might
Yeah.
be fake, but this guy is going to, like, let's just stay cool. And somehow we found a way to say, you know what? This is bigger than me. This is bigger than my
Mm.
little view of the world. And that we're going to find a way together to, to kind of create a better world for those who come after us.
Yeah, definitely. Would it also be fair to say, I love your point about that we should have a trigger response to things and the dangers of that. And would it also be fair to say that music is slowed down? Music teaches us that it's a process. I mean, we don't make things work on the first rehearsal. It works on the
Exactly.
penultimate rehearsal if we're lucky. And so
Yeah. And
it
sometimes at
just
the
made me
sixth
think about
performance,
that.
yeah, or sometimes it's
Exactly.
great by the third performance, and then all of a sudden something goes terribly wrong and you have to stop in the
Yes.
middle of the fifth. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's that
Exactly. Totally.
also music takes time, and also to understand music takes time. And so we can also maybe gain those lessons. And yeah, it just made me think about that. That's very, very
Absolutely.
interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question because, of course, it's one of these questions where it's like it depends on where you're based, and you're Canadian, but you live in Berlin, and you're working at a German house that's really one of the prominent houses. But do you ever feel? I mean, and you're also conductor, so you're coming at things also from a very musical side. But the struggle, do you feel a struggle for relevance within the classical music genre? I mean, what's your feeling about how we sort of fit into society, and what maybe our roles are as musicians, or how we should? Yeah, I'm curious
Do you
what you
mean like
think
as
about that.
young people, or as musicians
I
into
mean, as
the music world,
musicians,
or into like
within the
society at large?
artistic, within
Yeah.
society at large. I mean, that would be
Yeah.
the best one. But I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So
That's a
we
good
could we
question.
could we could take it down a step and say, rather, do you feel that there's a fight for relevance within this genre? And I know the relevance,
Yeah. I don't know. To be honest, if
is
there
it
is,
something you think
I'm
about,
like,
or
it's if there is, I'm very like I'm oblivious to a lot of things in life. I
okay.
got some huge screens up, and that is one of the. I I never had the feeling that opera or that classical music is irrelevant or in danger of being irrelevant. I don't know. Everywhere I turn, like, for example, one of my side things that I really love is basketball. Like, I don't know why I grew up in a house that all my brothers and I loved watching basketball together as kids, and I still follow the NBA. And I find it also there's a beautiful art to their athleticism too. Like, throwing an alley oop is just about as beautiful as the, Argerich and Barenboim playing an unbelievable duet on the piano. Both times you're just kind of in awe at the teamwork and the virtuosity of it. But yeah, in a way, like, for example, so in basketball, like Pau Gasol and Marc Gasol, they're two Spanish players, brothers in the league, and huge opera fans. Like, he used to play for the Chicago Bulls, and he would be going to the Chicago Lyric Opera. So I looked there and I thought, oh my gosh, there it is. Then you hear that Kanye West is interested in making an opera. Then you see that this guy is sampling from that track and this, and you say, okay, everybody who's going through it is kind of at some point, or somebody even who's hears for the first time like Pavarotti or a voice like that singing, and you're just like, whoa, like, what is that? How did that guy learn to do that with his little flap in his throat? So I don't know. I think I'd probably live in a bubble, but I never had the feeling that that classical music is in risk of becoming irrelevant.
Interesting. Yeah,
I know so
everyone
many
has
young
sort of.
people
We
think
all
about,
have
like,
different feelings about it.
yeah.
Or sorry, I cut
I was
you
gonna say,
off.
think about like you, me, Jana, like all of our friends around Berlin, like all of these young people that are like burning hot for classical music,
Yes.
and have all these friends like flying in from this place and sacrificing so many things in their lives to be able to just find their voice in this kind of thing. And that way, like, people also asked me before, like, do you think that there's too many kids going to music school, and that, like, there's no way there's gonna be enough jobs for all these kids coming out of music school? It's like, what do you think is better for a kid to be doing between the ages of 18 and 22? Like, getting a bunch of, financial information pounded down their skulls? I think this idea of actually trying to, kind of work on a craft like that, even trade school, things like that, like, you learn in working with natural elements, something about the world and something about yourself. And, like, think about, even in this kind of confinement time, how many people were drawn to things like making bread and all kinds of things like that, knitting and sewing masks and doing things like that.
Yeah.
And I think actually it's been a real, for the last maybe 50 years, we've been coming further and further away from that. And obviously things like technology are unbelievable, and they have, like, there's a reason we've come to, but to be honest, like, for me, a great and enjoyable challenge is trying to get somewhere without my GPS. I love that. To me, it's like,
Okay.
oh my gosh, wow. Because I've like the worst sense of direction of anybody in the world. Like, I get lost walking from the grocery store home. I don't know what it is, but for me, it's like really this kind of thing of wow. And it makes you feel alive again. And I think we were living under the false pretense that all of this that outsourcing everything to these devices and to this outside. No, it's actually not the answer. At some point you're outsourcing your pleasure, and you're outsourcing your trials and your trips. No, that's all part of it. The suffering is part of living too.
Wow. Yes.
I don't know how
love
that related to the rest of it. Suffering
I
part
don't
at
know
the
either,
end.
but I'm right there with you. It's yeah, I mean, it's exactly this time is certainly a magnifying glass on our, it gives us an objectivism on not only who we are and what we're doing, and for people like you and I who are very, very specifically in our little classical music world bubble, but also it gives you an objectivism about the world, for sure. So I love that point. Like, we've been racing through all my questions here. My goodness. No,
you don't need those questions, Ray.
Yeah,
throw them away. Do that thing. The guys rip them up and throw them off the side.
I could do that. But I won't. No, just kidding. No, I would also ask you, because you spoke a little bit about this at the beginning, but let's talk a little bit about education, because you talked about how was hugely important for you, and not just, I mean, let's go back even earlier. And I mean, I've had conversations with other guests like Renaud Loranger, and I had a long, nice chat about the importance of education and how that is sort of the future of classical music in the world. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about.
Yeah, I'm probably not the most qualified person to speak to music education, and that way I do feel like my journey has been kind of different than what the regular journey would be. But what I'm really interested to do is to find the people that are, and to really help amplify their voices in a way, and help to think, like, one thing I've been thinking about a lot, and I've been reaching out to people to try and speak more to not just colleagues of mine or people in my world, but actually people who have been teaching in the music world, like friends, parents who have been music teachers, for 30 years in a small community in Saskatchewan, or in, different in Quebec, and say, okay, like, what's your experience? Like, what have been the things that have changed in the last 30 years of music education, in the last 50 years of music education? What are the things that, like, in an ideal world, if funding and if you were not fighting against anything, if it was up to you, we were rebuilding society, and we started with you and said, what do you need in order to really, and if we, and like, what are the things that have gone wrong? Why have we gotten here? And more importantly, like, how can we take the step forward to, to follow in the
Mm-hmm.
footsteps of countries like Finland, in countries like Estonia, and I would even say
Mm-hmm.
places like Germany, and
Yes.
to really find a way to, build that, because I really think that with the committed, like, if all of the leading professional musicians of, like, let's take Canada as a country, because that's where we both are from. um, if everybody kind of stood behind that and said, okay, you know what, it's not just about the students too, it's about what do the teachers need in their training, like, what do they think after 15 years, and maybe contact with some professional musicians, and teachers would actually benefit both sides of it. I think
Mm-hmm.
every professional
Mm-hmm.
musician should give at least 10 to 20% of their energy and activity over the year to education, and to really foster, whether it's even if it means that you meet with, like, a few musicians a month and listen to them play and encourage them and give them some thoughts. It doesn't have to be criticism about their playing, even just to let them know, listen, this is, like, that's been something that for me has always been, I've been valued so highly, that I've been able to keep contact with musicians who have helped kind of answer some of the difficult questions that come up. And so I think a lot of ways we need to start by communicating better, figuring out what,
Mm-hmm.
what the ideal picture of things would be, what's a realistic version of how to take the first step in that direction, because that's another thing. You can't
Mm-hmm.
try and imagine that it's going to be by, next week it's going to be a very different thing. However, if we've learned one thing in the last 6 months, is that we have the potential to change way more quickly than we think we did. And think about, like, even when
Yeah.
kids come back to school, or it's not going to be an easy thing for them after this whole thing. And think about, like, how much music could be bonding and a calming and a
Mm-hmm.
really,
Mm-hmm.
meaningful way of welcoming them back. And that there's a power to that I think is really, that we should think about, and that we shouldn't wait to think about it.
Yeah. That's a really fascinating perspective, um, especially to talk to those people, not always the obvious people, but rather to everyone. What kind of answers have you been getting, or what? I mean, maybe like the top two things that come up.
Yeah, it's interesting. We need to do like a round table where we get them together. The challenge is
Mm-hmm.
often that when it's me speak, we end up inevitably rounding about the similar corners. It takes to
Mm-hmm.
build an accurate picture of what the landscape is, so that you're
Mm-hmm.
not just
Yes.
going in there. Because, I'll give you an example of where activism too quickly doesn't always meet the best ends, because like, now it's become popular, and I don't say this entirely disparagingly, because it's an important thing to do as
Mm-hmm.
well, but it's
Mm-hmm.
become very popular to try to dismantle the big companies for, and obviously there's been a lot of systemic problems over the
Mm-hmm.
years, and oppression of all
Mm-hmm.
different types. But however, we know the glacial rate of change that these big institutions, that even if they wanted to turn things around tomorrow, they just can't. That's not the nature of the way that system is built. And to sometimes, and in order to enact some of the things that would be proposed would mean to, like, fire, that's a lot of people's livelihood. And that's a lot of those people, and we're not respecting the fact that in generations gone by, working in those companies were already people with a contemporary idea of what equality ought to be, and the oppression that needed to be but they didn't, it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't, they laid the groundwork for us now to be able to have some real change. We can't be thinking that we are just coming in here with our magic wands and that's happening instantly. No, this has been on the backs of a lot of people who didn't get the benefit and the pleasure of seeing the change yet, but knew that they were contributing to something greater than themselves. And in that way, I think we need to understand that, again, to try and just point the finger and say, these are all the things, here's a list of everything that you've done wrong in the last 30 years. Is that important to know? Yes. Is that important to acknowledge? Absolutely. Is that the whole story? Not even the first 5%. And that, have you ever, like, imagine, let's take the analogy now back to the rehearsal room. Say I want to convince, say I'm conducting a symphony and there's an oboe solo and he has a totally different concept of the sound world of that piece, of the rubato, of whatever the stylistic things might be than I do. Am I more likely to bring him to my way of thinking by first disparaging him in front of all of his colleagues? Or is it by encouraging his innate musicality towards a vision that is more cohesive with the whole? And like, we need to realize that it's hiding behind computers and blogs and things like that. And that's not and maybe I shouldn't say it that way, because it's not, we don't hide behind the blogs. In a big way, we're actually, people having their voices heard is so important, but we have to remember that there comes also responsibility with that. And that if our goal is to actually affect positive change, then those things need to always be focused in a way that they would appeal to everybody reading them, that they would appeal to everybody, that I would read that and think to myself, you know what? Maybe I have been approaching that wrong in rehearsal, and that thing I've been saying subconsciously, it's almost like a reflex that I would say a certain thing maybe to a musician, and that actually is interpreted in a very different way than with which I intended. And that's an important lesson to learn, but I would be a lot more open to that if it was kind of come at with the right style of rhetoric. So,
right. Which also kind of brings us back to that, what music can offer us is the specific kind of rhetoric around these subjects, or a specific way of thinking for the group, or of thinking, like you said, what way would this be cohesive ultimately?
Yeah. Listen, music, being a professional musician gives you the fact that you have these constant checkups. You have performances. You can also just always be rehearsing. In our lives, often we're always just in rehearsal mode, not even working towards a dress rehearsal. We're just in the performance of our lives. We're just thinking about, oh yeah, let's just do this. And then we go on to something else. We don't have, when you perform, you have to say, on Friday, we actually have to play this piece for a paying public. We can't just leave these things as, So in that way, I don't at all mean to tell people who are finding their own, because that's the other thing, is that these things take time to develop, and that nobody should ever, there should be, first of all, you shouldn't believe anything anybody says until they're like, 35 years old, and you should be forgiven for all things that you do until, you know what I mean, or until you're 40, or until you're 50 years old.
We've still got some time.
Old,
Okay.
That you really, that everything, that you're allowed to change your mind, that's okay. And that you're allowed to make mistakes, and that you're allowed to, early on, in a fit of passion and of wanting to affect positive change, say things in not the best possible way. That's totally okay. And to come back and to say, okay, you know what, and to shape your voice. That's actually what we're all doing. And so maybe that requires also, from people like me, from other people, a patience as well, and an understanding to say that's not easy either. That's not easy to be the ones. And it is an important part of it. All sides of the equation are an important part of it.
Yes. And it also makes me think of, one of the reasons I'm a musician myself is because I love listening to music. And I think that's it. This makes me think about also music, and being in this world teaches you that, to listen, just to listen, and to sit back and, like you say, not be trigger responsive. And in a way, if you go to a night to hear a Mahler symphony, it's glacial. It's not even your own journey on that. So I think that's a really, really interesting, really great point to really think about as well, about this world that we're creating, or rather that we're a part of. I have one question from what you said earlier, which is, at some point we were talking about the teachers, and you said that you mentioned that where we went wrong, and I'm curious, what do you mean by that? Where did we go wrong?
I think it's never really, you can't trace it back to like a historical date, but you can see that, like, take Canada, for example, that if
Mm,
you look over the last 30 years at the dismantling of music in the public school system, for
mhm,
example, that's an example of, I think, us to going in the wrong
mhm.
direction, of
Yeah.
thinking that this is about saving dollars and things like that.
Yeah.
Again, this is a reminder to us. There's always money available for what's important, and not that's not always what it's earmarked for, because that's not always the priorities of those who are making those decisions.
Mhm.
But I understand that there could be some people who say, "Hey, come on, what? You don't have to have all those kids beating drums in the room. How is that helping anybody? And that we should be teaching them science." But to be honest, this is a probably bigger discussion, because I think education reform in
Yes.
a way bigger way, and that has less to do also with, that maybe in a nutshell, I would say that I had the feeling as kid going to school, even, that okay, there's so many great parts of school, and there's so many things that just don't, like, who is this built for? And as I've grown up and I start to think, it's almost
Yeah.
like the school systems were devised in an age in which, they were building people to work in factories, and that's the way we still go to school and learn, as if we were. And that's not the world except our world is going so much further towards automation, that it's like,
Exactly.
wait a second, this whole way of learning, the idea of having to just memorize a bunch of dry historical facts as if that's what's important. No, not about trying to
Mhm.
ignite the passion of a child, or find out what it is that they could contribute to the world, and what part of critical thinking and asking questions about the world around you, and things like that. And so I think this is kind of a bigger theme that ought to be. And to be honest, I don't think we've ever had so much potential in the last 50 years than right now, to actually think
Mhm.
about these, because the whole education system is about to be turned on its head anyways. So maybe
Yes.
if we start to get listening to the right people, which are some of those teachers who are too busy being underfunded and having to do way more work than any one human being could be expected to do, that they don't have time to actually engage in these things, that they just have to play along. We got to figure out a way to do that. But hopefully we're
Mhm.
going to find a way to empower them
Mhm.
in a much better way, because there's not many people in society more important than those who are teaching our children.
Amen. Yes. Yeah. I'm really thank you for clarifying your thoughts on that, and I'm really inspired by it. Um, yeah, gives me a lot to think about. um, so one thing I like to always make sure I ask my guests, hence the title of the show, is when has music been revolutionary to you? Can it be revolutionary, and how?
Yeah, I guess the least interesting way, the easiest answer would be a dry historical one. And
Let's hear it.
there's so many well documented stories of that, whether it's, kind of Beethoven, or, all of those kinds of things. I think music has never stopped being revolutionary. I think in that way, that
Mm,
if you actually tap into the source of it, you realize that it's always been a kind of, it's not always what you wanted to hear, but it's always what the world needed. And even if you think about contemporary music
mm,
today, maybe some people would say, and you think about, like, if you read 100 years ago reviews, and that's easy to think about because those pieces are things like by Stravinsky, things like that. And you realize the
mm,
way people were like, or Bartok, they're just like, whoa, 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 what is this? And and I think that the revolutionary nature of music has been gifted by all of the great minds that have guided its history, and that you can't silence them anyways. A lot of people have tried over the years, and in that way, I never even I pick up really old scores, and I really
mm.
feel like it's a revolution in there. You think, whoa,
Yeah.
how and it's not about even breaking rules. It's about,
Mhm.
the rules weren't written yet. The rules were written after somebody could actually just have read this score, and they're like, whoa, that's something unusual. How do I explain that? So I feel the revolution is still very much on.
Love it. I love that. Jordan, I could talk to you for many more hours, but luckily we live in the same city, so we can do
Exactly. I'm sure
so.
I'll see you soon. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. It's really, like, really been such a pleasure to have you on
Thanks
the
for having
show.
me, Rach. Great to see you.
Really,
Have fun
thank
in
you.
Salzburg. Look forward
Thank
to
you.
hearing
And
about it.
thanks. for those of you who tuned in today, also make sure you check out Jordan's really beautiful playlist. It's linked, attached underneath this episode, and it's got lots of great gems and music that's important to him. So I definitely urge you to check it out. Otherwise, thank you so much again, Jordan. And I'll see you all next Wednesday.